Thank you, Annie. So tonight I have the really enviable task of introducing three fantastic panelists speaking to a book that they all contributed to. The book is Welcome to the Revolution. The primary author of the book is Charlie Derber. In addition, the book is strengthened by work from about 30 different thinkers, activist thinkers, who introduce the many sides to that a book of this scope, a book with this ambition addresses. So without the addition of these voices, I think the subtitle of the book, Universalizing Resistance for Social Justice and Democracy in Perilous Times, without these thinkers, I think the ambition and the scale of that promising subtitle would not be realized. However, the three speakers I get to introduce tonight, Charlie Derber, a professor at Boston College and a public sociologist, Mike Prokosh of the Boston Climate Action Network, and Katherine Asuncion of the Student Immigrant Movement, will all bring the kinds of things that I think I would like to see up front in public conversations all the time. And they'll do so from many different angles. I have a little bit of difficulty, a feeling of challenge in thinking about the book, primarily because of the scale of its ambition. After this event and after talking with you've had a chance to engage with the speakers, I think you'll feel with me that it has gone a long way to meeting the challenges it sets for itself. So I'd like to introduce Charlie Derber from Boston College. Charlie.
So, people are spread out here. Can you hear me okay? Chuck, can you hear me way back there? Okay, let me know if I fade, or sometimes I'll, swing one way or another from the mic. I want to thank Seren, has been an incredibly close collaborator, intellectually, politically, in every way. I don't think this project could have happened without him. Chuck Collins, thank you for making this forum, along with Annie, making this possible. And Mike and Kathy, thank you for coming for this. The book is really an argument to try to figure out what makes, we're in such a critical era of political danger and political possibility, and it's an era of resistance. The establishment is cracking on both the right and the left. We're seeing, major important forms of resistance. And, given what's at stake, the survival of the planet is at stake, not just because of nuclear war and climate change, but the whole economic system has become so lethal. And so the book is ambitious because, as Seren says, because the book tries to make the argument that all of these profound crises we're facing, whether we're dealing with, climate or economic crisis or militarism and possibility of nuclear war in places like Korea or Iran, or with, racism, sexism, all of the immigration crisis. These are all, in my view, that they're like strands of DNA. The society we face is a system, a capitalist, militarized system in which we have all of these integral, hierarchical, intertwined structures of power. And that's why I'm sort of glad that, like when I speak, that we have people who are speaking from, the ground up with a lot of experience in these different struggles. One of the huge problems of our resistance is that these struggles have been relatively siloed, separate. People don't know each other well or don't necessarily coordinate well. So a big part of the book is trying to understand what a more integrated, holistic kind of movement will look like. And I know there are people in the audience like, your name again is Andrew, right? Who has been building, one of many people who are trying to think about how to build coordinated campaigns and bring people together on these systemic issues. So, you know, there's no science of resistance. I mean, I wish there were. I wish we knew exactly what to do, but we don't. So when I'm faced with uncertainty, I generally like to look at history and say, well, what have we learned from history that has worked and that has failed, and what are lessons for today? And I also like, well, this is a book primarily, and I imagine a conversation that is primarily about progressives and the left. I mean, we're confronting what I call a massive universalizing resistance movement on the right as well, which is being led by Trump right now. And so when a large system of capitalism is losing, you know, people are losing faith in it, when it's cracking in many important ways, there's always a contest that goes on between a right-wing resistance and a left-wing resistance. And I want to start out by just saying, you know, we have a lot to learn from right-wing resistance. So I just want to start out quickly with Trump. And because a lot of people started wondering, I mean, I'm sure all of you have thought and talked a lot about how could a man like Trump win? And so I have a simple answer. I'm not going to go into any great detail, except to say historically, Trump is not unprecedented. We've seen people like Trump, right-wing populists, demagogues, coming up under conditions of severe economic distress for a long, long time. Trump, I think the left resistance has a lot to learn from Trump, starting out with the question of just how did he win? And he won by doing a kind of, you know, the subtitle of this book is called Universalizing Resistance. And I think that you can universalize resistance on the left and the right. And Trump is a pretty effective universalizer on the right. He's anti-systemic, at least in his rhetoric. He's challenging the whole system. He's highly disruptive and takes pride in it. He offers, and I want to go into this a little bit more, he offers a very strong right-wing class politics. He's dealing with the issue of class tied to the issues of identity politics. And he has a very compelling right-wing identity politics going on. And they're integrated. And I think this is a huge crisis for left-wing resistance. Universalizing resistance, as I sort of talk about it in the book, one of its characteristics is that it requires a very strong class politics tied to an identity politics that has a very strong class sensibility, awareness. And we have a lot of identity movements on the left that do not have significant class perspectives. So let me just talk briefly about Trump. So Trump's class politics is sort of what got him, I think, the most initial attention. He said there's a bunch of workers in America who are the forgotten people, and they are losing ground. They're, they're not going to be as well off as their parents. They're living in shuttered communities without work and so forth. And, you know, he did something very important that the left has not done for a very long time. He made the condition of the working class in America a central political focus, right? It's kind of odd to think about this because you think, why in the world would somebody on the right or a right wing be successful in doing that when this has sort of always been presumably something that the left has always been centrally concerned with in a capitalist society, the condition of workers and the fundamental exploitation of that system. So I just want to say that, you know, he used, and he had a strategy for this. I mean, a label, a rhetoric, and it's around the idea of nationalism, arguing that the country and the world has been taken over by liberal or cosmopolitan globalists who don't care a whit for the working people of the United States. and they're being left behind and abandoned. And he put his finger on a very sensitive pulse. He gave it a name, he gave it full attention. He was very, very clever. However wacko and incoherent, and maybe he has dementia. I don't know what all his issues are with his language and so forth. But he did something very, very important, which is he gave voice and put at the center of the conversation the declining, despairing, forgotten American, as he called it. It was very compelling right-wing class analysis. And he had an analysis of actually, he went after trade agreements, he went after certain kinds of globalist corporate elites and so forth. He did it more effectively than the left has been talking about class for a long time. I want to get into that later on. At the same time, he brought together an incredibly persuasive, the right wing is often very good at appealing to emotions and the irrational. We've seen that in right-wing movements for a long time, partly because they're often tied to religion and to certain kinds of traditional cultural things that the left has either repudiated or is not comfortable with. And the left is this goes back to the Enlightenment and the embrace of science and some discomfort with bringing in emotion and the irrational. Where the left is sort of embracing science and so forth. And there have been a number of books written that are very useful, which look at this whole situation we're in back to the conflict between the Enlightenment and the feudal religious period and so forth. But the main thing I want to suggest is that he put together around cultural nationalism a resistance movement that really highlighted in a quite compelling way right-wing class politics, focused on the problems of the working class, with a right-wing identity politics, which is all around nationalism, which was reinterpreted by Steve Bannon and people like that as sort of white European nationalism, that in other words, the Americans could be proud of their white European heritage, and within that, there were a number of closely related factors having to do with race. It was white. With traditional versus global, liberal, coastal, cosmopolitan values. So family values, traditional gender values, traditional family values, and so forth. And, it's not hard when you step back to say why this guy was so compelling and why he was able to, if you just even bracket the Russian intervention, the Comey thing, Hillary's clear weaknesses as a candidate, other factors that might have been, one should give very important attention to right-wing universalizing movements. They came up in Germany in the late 20s and 30s. This has been a huge part of global history. And so the last thing we should do is dismiss the power of extremely compelling right-wing class and identity politics. Okay, so now I want to shift over to history, and a history which is kind of both hopeful and disturbing about resistance and movements on the left. So I want to, I'm always a teacher. I see you raise your hand, and I thought, oh, there must be a question. There are a number of my students here, so I'm happy that they're here. Bianca, where are you? Are you taking pictures? You should get BC students who are here in these pictures. So I would say, on the hopeful side, there have been since the Civil War, there have been 3 prior universalizing resistance movements, eras of universalizing resistance. Not perfectly so on the left. The first was the populist movement of the 1890s. That was a movement when modern capitalism came into, that was the, the age of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Carnegie. They cemented modern corporate global capitalism. In 1890, Rockefeller became the country's first billionaire, while 90% of the country was living in poverty. So you had extreme inequality. Everybody here knows Chuck's focus on extreme inequality. That's a good sort of, way of thinking about when you're likely to see left and right-wing movements, universalizing movements come into being. That's a marker. So the populists, where were they from? Yeah, they were from Kansas. Remember Thomas Frank, what's the matter with Kansas? Well, there just wasn't anything wrong with Kansas in 1890, right? These were people who were out doing the lecture circuit. They had a very strong, sort of an Occupy agenda. They wanted to occupy Wall Street. They were the first real Occupy movement in the United States. They had a strong political platform. They formed a party called the People's Party in 1892. And historians like a guy named Lawrence Goodwin, who wrote a book called The Populist Moment, which, if you're interested in this in history, you should look at, which said this was the most basic, grassroots, progressive, democratic movement in American history. Now, it had flaws. There was racism in this movement. It didn't reach all the urban workers by any means. It was anti-Semitic in certain ways, but it embodied, it was disruptive, anti-systemic, and it was grassroots-based. And it brought together a lot of different people. So it had this universalizing quality. That's wave number one. Universalizing wave number two. I'm just going to go through these things quickly. The New Deal. So capitalism again goes into severe crisis. You get some progressives, sort of elite, liberal, New Deal people connected with Roosevelt who take over the government, but none of that really would have gone anywhere without an eruption of grassroots labor on the ground, people fighting evictions, as you're beginning to see here, right in Jamaica Plain. There are strong movements of this kind in Boston. There were a whole series of people who were in desperate situation. And there were people like Trump, who were on the right, like Father Coughlin and so forth, who were trying to appeal to these people. But, you had this incredibly strong movement on the ground of workers, people who most of us don't relate to very well today. And I want to find out a little bit more about how people right in this room think of themselves in relation to the working class, or to people who don't have, say, college education. But, in the 30s, you had a movement of, a cross-class movement, but you had a lot of grassroots labor organizing for the first time for the right to organize, to get the legal right to unions. And you had socialists and communists and leftists working right alongside of them. They were important parts of that movement. And, I wouldn't say that they were fully anti-systemic, that is, the New Dealers themselves. But you got this rush of energy and resistance on the ground. That was really, really impressive. And you got this idea of universal social welfare protections, Social Security emerged, universal working standards and other things that were things that, is central to a class politics and a class society. So, and that period lasted long before, after the death of Roosevelt, well into the 60s. And then you got universalizing resistance wave number 3, which was the 60s itself, which was, an incredibly revolutionary moment. It started with the civil rights movement and extended with the, anti-war, anti-Vietnam movement, and then it moved on into, whoops. That's the second time. Are you okay? Yeah. Nick, you're okay. Disruption is always compelling, so. Nick, are you okay? Yeah, okay. So, and this is the movement I know and sort of shaped me politically, the 60s. And I'm still reassessing it for reasons that I'll describe to you. Because it had many, many incredibly, like I'll use Martin Luther King as what I would say the most positive, universalizing aspect of this. Because King started out as a civil rights worker and leading the civil rights movement. And that's how most people remember him. But two things that people in this room probably are well aware of is that he turned against the war. And even though, and there was the beginning already of this siloization of the movement, people says, no, if you're civil rights, you're going to weaken the civil rights movement if you turn against the war. And he nonetheless turned against the war and wrote some very important book, a book on Vietnam and speeches. And then, what did he do next, right before he was assassinated? Working people. He went to Memphis, he walked with the trash, and then against war generally, yeah. So he became, in that sense, what I call a universalizing resistor. He, against the grain of the civil rights movement at that time, he said that I cannot, do the work I'm doing in civil rights unless I become an anti-war worker and an activist, and unless I become a labor activist, a class-based activist. So, in my mind, that embodied the best of the progressive universalizing resistance. It's noteworthy that he was shot and killed in Memphis, right, when he joined the labor movement, which to me was a sign of how dangerous that is. That when you bring together these different movements and somebody in a civil rights movement becomes highly focused on class and labor issues, the elites really worry about that. And they reach into the grassroots. And I don't think it's purely, he knew that he was going to be shot when he started focusing more on these broader issues. So, but I'm proud of having been, a part of the 60s and of that wave of resistance, which I would call a wave of universalizing resistance. But, this was the beginning also of what I see now as our current problems as we move into the current age. One is the left in the 60s, while it was universalizing, was beginning to, even though it was still toward the end, moving toward an analysis of capitalism and toward labor, it was a movement of privileged students who were white, mostly male leadership. You had, of course, a civil rights movement that was active and there was cross-class. But in many ways, the working class became very alienated in this phase from the movement. And there's an old saying that, the working class didn't like the war in Vietnam, but they disliked more the protesters against the war in Vietnam. And that was the beginning of something really, really important that happened at the end of the 60s and early 70s, which I would say is a really key marking point in history. Because at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, you began to see the fragmentation of the left into, two things happened. One, you began to see the abandonment of a kind of progressive left politics sort of organized and spoken for by the working class itself. Educated people began to become divorced from working class people in this country. And the left began to be reshaped as I don't want to be pejorative about this because I'm not against identity politics, but it became a sort of a grab bag of siloed identity movements, which did not connect with working class people and which did not connect with each other, and sort of turned the left into a much more fragmented movement that was not capable of generating a kind of broader politics that could reach out beyond the identity communities they were speaking for into the larger society. Now, it was exactly at that moment. So the left lost its focus on class, which is the beginning of Trumpism, when the left began to abandon its focus and be a voice for the left. And the unions the unions were being assaulted, but they also played their own role in abandoning a lot of the sort of resistance that had to become on a class basis. So the 60s, I'm now feeling, and the new right was beginning this universalizing right politics in the early 70s. There was a meeting of corporate leaders who began a very coordinated agenda, and that hooked in with the evangelical movements in the South and racial politics and so forth. And you began to get these movements which triumphed in the Reagan Revolution and then, now in Trumpism. So, what we've got, in my view now, is a left that has become profoundly weakened centrally by a few things. One, by the loss of a really robust left-class politics. Not that there aren't groups and people, there are a lot of them who are talking about economics, like Chuck Collins, right? I mean, they're doing important work. But in general, I would say that the left has put its energies and its focus and is known for its work in basically around identity politics issues. And those have been very important. The progress of women and people of color and so forth is very important. But let me just, I'll take a provocative, hard view on this for a minute, even though I'm not one of these class people who says we should do away with identity politics. I don't feel that. I feel identity politics are very important. But when identity politics loses a sensitivity to class, it becomes a reaffirmer of the system. I think of people like Sheryl Sandberg. Do you know Sheryl Sandberg, the idea of the woman who's at Facebook, who wrote the book called Leaning In, and is seen as a second-wave feminist in some ways and so forth? Well, what did leaning in mean? It means you want to sort of break the glass ceiling for women by getting into the top levels of the corporation, right? And that became sort of her aim as a feminist. Well, that had two big problems. One is it reinforced the system itself, right? It said, well, these corporate capitalist things are things we want to get, or it might be a military thing. We want the rights to go as high as possible in these capitalist structures. It just lost the ability to connect with a class politics. And so a small number of women were going to benefit from this kind of feminist politics, right? If you were a working class woman, if you were a black woman, or a woman who was not in those educated white circles that Sheryl Sandberg represented, feminism was not going to help you. So this kind of identity politics, stripped away from class politics, would undermine feminism itself. So in my view, identity politics has to be a class politics as well, just to fulfill the mission of identity politics. Or else you're simply reinforcing the structure of the overall political economy. Okay, I know I'm running late, Seren, you're being tolerant, so I'm going to just end by sort of suggesting, so I'm saying the left has really serious organizational, ideological problems right now. And the right, many people feel very depressed because they feel, while there was a lot of motion immediately after Trump, that somehow, if there's going to be a revolution, welcome to the revolution, they might think this is a book about the Trump revolution and about the right gaining ascendancy. And it's not. It's about the left. So let me just briefly give you three, I'll be quick about this, Seren, three things that give me some sense of hope and direction for a new progressive universalizing on the left. The first thing is just Trump himself has become so outrageous. And, I know that there's all this talk about the base, which is about 35% of the population, which is hardcore Trump. And a lot of those people, whether they're working class or more traditional country club Republicans or whoever they are, the left will never attract. But it's not a majority of the population. And if you look at public opinion polls, on almost every issue that Trump is working on now, and this has been true long before Trump with the Republican Party, even though whites have been voting Republican now for several decades, the opinion polls on specific issues are very left of center. People say they hate corporate money in politics. They like unions, believe it or not. They love Medicare. When you look now at at the current moment, not only have you begun to see this sort of broad reservoir of anger about what Trump is doing, and at Trump himself. You had the biggest protests in history when Trump, with the Women's March, and then this marches around the travel ban and all the other protests against Trump. But you've got things that we didn't expect. So Bernie Sanders, not only has Obamacare become popular, and more popular than what the Republicans have been offering, but for the first time, a poll has come out which shows that a majority of Americans favor a single-payer system, which is quite dramatic. It's during the Trump era. In other words, the extreme, has turned public opinion even more progressively than one might have thought. So, and I would tie into that the idea that we're entering, this is really important, like the next few months, because the core economic issues that are going to determine how class plays out politically are going to happen with the tax and budget debates that are going to go on in Congress in the next few months. And Trump is pushing an agenda, I'm sure you guys have followed the last few days, where he says this is a working class, middle class miracle. It's a tax program for, but if you look, and we can talk about this, I'm sure most of you are aware of it, this is Chuck the other day called this a money grab. It's it's going to be reaching in working class people's pockets and taking most of what they have. And it's an enormous boondoggle for the rich. And people should just be very clear about this. Much of what he does, Trump is lying about his budget, his tax, and what he's doing for workers. What he's doing is going to be devastating. But that is not, people, especially when the right-wing, emotional, irrational kind of dynamic is in play, there has to be a way of bringing those facts in a way that's consistent with emotional resonance, which the left has problems with these days. And we should talk, I'd like if you agree with me, I'd like in the Q&A to talk a little about the left and emotion and irrationality and how to speak when politics is always emotional and irrational, and how one speaks to that on the left. We know the right can do that very effectively. Okay, so I see hope in the fact that I think that the debate about taxes and the budget are a real opportunity to raise the class issue and show that right-wing populism, speaking for the working class, is screwing the working class. The working class is going to be devastated by these policies. So that's one possibility. Number two, the demographics, two for hope. The demographics of the country are changing, as you know. By 2050, the country will be minority white, majority non-white. And what's happening already that you're seeing is that the working people of the country, the working class of the country, is increasingly people of color and women. So the classic white craft unionism, which has had problems, is going to be undergoing a shift. This is why I need a mic, my voice goes out. We're seeing a change in the population where it's inevitable that the working class is going to be melded together across race and across gender on these class issues. To my mind, this means that labor and identity are going to be melded together just by the demographic shifts. So we haven't seen this before, but I don't think it's going to be possible to maintain this distinction between class and identity issues. As women and people of color sweep into the labor market and are at the bottom of it, you're going to see a different kind of labor movement, and you're going to see a different kind of class politics tied into identity issues, number two. Number three, politics itself. So I'm going to take Sanders. So the most popular politician, according to polls today in the country, is Bernie Sanders, right? And the working class, a lot of the same workers who voted for Trump, and also for Obama, actually, voted for Sanders. Now, Sanders is I mean, whatever you think about the current state of the Sanders progressive Democratic Party thing, there is something sort of important going on. Remember, universalizing resistance, in my mind, also requires what people have traditionally called a united front. That's what fell apart in Germany when right-wing universalizing was taking place, meaning that movements are always in a complicated dance with electoral politics and with mainstream parties. And so we're in an era where the Sanders wing of the party is in a really significant struggle with the mainstream Wall Street. You know, the Clintons essentially abandoned the New Deal, abandoned class politics, and threw the Democratic Party in with Wall Street. And that was a lot of the baggage that Hillary was carrying when she lost working class votes, and when she embraced neoliberal trade agreements and a lot of other such things. So my hope is that there's going to be a renaissance of a kind of dance, if I can call it that, between left movements and Democratic Party progressive activists that can, you know, we need a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party. You know, that's what Trump did, right? He's conducting a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. So I think the left in this 30 or 40 years, since the end of the 60s, has abandoned class politics. It also pretty much abandoned electoral politics. And I see now, this is my third hope, it's just a hope, that we can see a kind of new interaction between the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and left movements that can coalesce and help bring these ideas, like, for example, single-payer health care, you know, worker ownership. And there's a whole set of economic issues that Sanders raised, which are very important, or money in politics. And so that it's an issue that is retaken up by the left and also becomes central to more and more of the Democratic Party. It's not accidental that 16 of the people who co-sponsored the Medicare for All bill with Sanders are the people who people think are going to run as president on the Democratic Party ticket in 2020. So I'll leave you with that. There's no guarantees here in life, but there's some hope that we can see. I think it's really difficult. The left is in a very emotionally and politically complicated situation right now. But I honestly see reasons for hope, and God knows we need it, because if we don't keep this struggle alive, we're all going to be in deep trouble. Sorry for going on a little bit too long.
Thank you, Charlie, and you definitely did not take too long. You know, one of the things I've always appreciated about Charlie across nearly 20 books is the fact that he's able to combine a conversation with the individual and their emotional soul with a conversation about politics. And I see that plays out in this book. And one of the places in which it plays out is by his involvement of Katherine Asuncion from the student immigrant movement in the book. A point that Charlie made throughout the presentation is, how do we balance, how do we articulate identity politics with class politics? And when we think of the student immigrant movement, which Kathy is a member of, actually the development director of the student immigrant movement, it's easy to say it's just another identity-based group. However, I do think they embody the kind of thing that Charlie hopes for in terms of being able to articulate both the class politics and an identity politics for the following reasons. I should also say that my insights are based on the fact that her office is just a couple of offices away from mine. So over the years, I've had a chance to see them at work. The student immigrant movement has people who, like me, speak with foreign accents and with American accents. And so it's a movement made up of people of many different identities. However, one of the things they all share in common is that it involves people who are undocumented, and it involves young people. And they are able to understand the fact, given exactly where they are, that their situation of questionable legality in modern-day capitalist America is one that's a product of a concrete economic system, a distinctive set of practices, and they've been able to, working with people like themselves, undocumented young people, working with them to develop leadership from their ranks across different ethnicities. So I've heard Russian accents, I've heard people from Brazil, people from parts of Central America, from Haiti, from parts of Africa as well. So this suggests to me the promise of a new kind of politics, and I believe that in their activities, by speaking with people of so many diverse identities and all, they contain in microcosm a different kind of politics, a class-aware politics that does not exclude or annihilate particular identities or particular oppressions. We never saw this sort of more distinctly posed as when Obama threatened to essentially separate parents from children through DACA. DACA was a great thing in some respects, but it basically set up young people from in opposition to their parents, a really cruel dilemma. And this is an example of the kind of politics and political choices that people have to make in this new era as we try to universalize. We need to deal with the fact of trade-offs. And so it's on that basis, and thinking both internationally, given the fact that immigration is a global question, and thinking about politics in this country in a very concrete way, that I'm happy to introduce Katherine Asuncion to this conversation.
Thank you, Seren. I want to also say thank you to Charlie for allowing me the chance to write my essay in the book, and to Chuck and to all of you for being here and for doing your part to start the revolution. So my name is Katherine. I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, and when I came in 2003 with my parents, my brother and my little sister, I did not know that we were going to be facing discrimination like we are. That when, in my country, in the Dominican Republic, you have family members that live here already, and they never tell us that you could be deported if you're here. So we came and I learned the language. I saw myself as a member of this community. I was like, okay, cool, this is different from what I've experienced. Definitely feel safer. I feel safe here because in my country, even being in the front porch was dangerous. As like, we had an experience where like, we were sitting outside and we had just like finished eating, and a lady came asking for help, and we're like, oh my God, what's going on? And literally, like as we're trying to like help her into our house, like we see her like get like robbed by two guys. So that was really scary. However, us living here is like a different kind of fear, a different kind of danger. One that's even scarier, I want to say. So I didn't know what it was like to be undocumented until I was a junior in high school. After I've seen my dad be paranoid that he was gonna get deported because he was using a fake social to work. And like he did what he needed to do to help us survive. And I saw as my parents declined in health and age and like were sadder and like meaner. They're still lovely, but I saw how like they changed being in this country. And it just made me like realize like I need to do something, something's wrong. And when I was a senior in high school, I finally decided that I would tell someone that I was undocumented. To try to understand, really coming out of my mouth, like saying my status, trying to understand how I could change things for myself. I hoped that by saying that I was undocumented, that it would make me understand why I was documented, like, and how I can solve it. I learned about SIN, the student immigrant movement, through my guidance counselor. And I went to my first rally, and I met hundreds of undocumented youth just like me, sharing their story, like marching, saying, undocumented, unafraid. And all I kept thinking was like, they're crazy. I'm super afraid. Like, you guys are out of control, like what? But still, I felt like I was in the right place. So I kept getting involved, but I got involved for myself. I'm gonna be honest with y'all. I got involved because I wanted to get papers and wanted to get my parents' papers. And that was all I wanted at that moment. We kept fighting, kept being like part of SIM and going to meetings, and I really didn't know about the system that we lived in. I didn't know why I wasn't documented. I just know that I was. And like, not knowing like what happened, like why I wasn't documented, felt better than knowing why I wasn't documented. When we lost the DREAM Act, I chose to separate myself from the movement because I couldn't get my papers. Like, oh, like this didn't pass. I blamed the movement for not winning, for being weak. But like, there is a person in this movement that like brought me back in, and her name is Lily, and she told me, Kathy, like we need you because you are the leader that like we're training to take on this movement to not just get yourself papers, but get everybody papers and get everybody to have dignity in this country because this is their home. And that clicked in me. So we fought for DACA. When we got DACA, because we were seeing young people getting like deported, we had to stop. In SIN, we stopped the deportation of 2 of our members. 2 of them, like they're both Brazilian, both in school, and they were placed in deportation proceedings for like dumb reasons. They got caught like in the train, so like because of raid. Like, how messed up is that like you're coming from your house to see your girlfriend or like a loved one, and you're in a train and you have to fear being kicked out of the country. That was a pain that like I knew, and like we all knew. So we went DACA, and we were so thrilled to have all these young people come to us. We were like, wow, look at all these youth that we can organize, we can build our movements, we can keep fighting to save our parents, because they sold our parents off. And my mom was like, Kathy, you're in those clinics helping people apply for the DACA, but why aren't you doing yours? What are you waiting for? I'm like, Mom, like, chill, I'm gonna get my DACA, like, don't worry, like, it's gonna be okay. She's like, no, like, you got this, take advantage of it. And like, I could see like the pain in her eyes because she didn't qualify. And like, she wasn't gonna get it. She wasn't gonna get DACA magically. And it hurt my soul to say, like, to hear her say that because I knew that I didn't know how to help her in that moment. But we could keep fighting. What we didn't know was that getting DACA was actually gonna be a blow to us. Because all those youth that came over to our clinics to get their DACA, many of them like went back to their lives and did not join the movement. We got caught up in the victory, in the let's get people their DACA, and that's how awesome it is. And we didn't do a good job at getting people to understand that this fight continues. We lost our urgency. It did not mean that we stopped fighting, but it did hurt our movement. The year after we won DACA, we saw a bunch of raids happening. Mad people getting deported. We're like, oh my God, like, we're getting people, like young people their DACA and they're happy, but like, we're not retaining leaders. Our parents are being deported. We gotta keep fighting. We don't have the strength. But we kept fighting. In SIN specifically, I saw how all of our young people were like, okay, like we got DACA now, but what's still hurting our families? They're like, oh, like we can't afford going to college, and people are still getting deported. So we try to figure out ways to get people into the organization. We try to pass institution. It's been our goal since we started back in 2005. In a little office, like in a little space in East Boston, Carlos Saavedra and like other young people were like, what do? We need to go to college. We're gonna get into tuition. And it still hasn't happened. And it's taking us many years to realize that we can keep fighting for DACA and for institution, but like our power isn't strong enough to change the minds of these politicians that are just seeing us as tools. Because if we go to college and get an education, we're stronger. And they knew that like if they can just be like, okay, have the young people go to college, but keep the parents working. So like they don't get access to benefits or taxes, but like the young people, let them be useful to this economy. And like I felt like we fell into that trap. But now that DACA is gone, a lot of our youth that we have been in contact with, they're figuring their lives out. And they're not coming to clinics. They're not seeking out for help. And it's been happening like this since Trump got elected. We've been seeing people actually like get really afraid. And it makes me wonder, is our movement strong enough? Sorry, I keep hitting this. We have amazing like resistance happening now that DACA has been taken away. We have like 5 days until people can apply for the renewal. And thank you, I want to say thank you to Hope and the JP Roxbury Coalition, because they're doing a fundraiser to help the DACA recipients that are eligible to apply for the renewal to get some money for the fee. And I think that's awesome, thank you. Talk to Hope afterwards. But there's more resistance happening. We're not stopping right there. In SIM, we have been talking about like, why are we undocumented? And to be honest with y'all, I didn't really know. My friend, he's like super smart. He sat me down in a classroom at UMass Boston. And he laid out for me like everything about like imperialism, colonization, capitalism, and he like broke down like all of the terms. And for 3 hours, he did this to me. I was alone in a chair as he just said everything. And when he was done, he looked at me, I looked back at him, and I just started crying. Literally just break down crying. And we decided we're gonna do a political education program within SIM to teach our members about capitalism and about US imperialism. Because right now we have all of our youth thinking that they did something wrong, that they are criminals, that they made a mistake by coming here. And like, you see these politicians brainwashing the minds of working class American citizens, saying that immigrants come and like steal their jobs, when it was actually US interfering in our countries. Like, dismantling governments that we democratically elected, stealing our resources, having corporations come in and like destroying their local economies. We're here because of the US, and they have the audacity to say that we're the criminals. I mean, like, come on. Like, right now, SIM is still a small organization. We're still doing our best to stay in touch with all of our members that need to learn about like the broader political education, to like learn the things that I learned while sitting in that chair at UMass Boston. I will say that like we're still getting caught up in identity politics, but we are trying to move past that. It's a process, and for our youth who literally are told to stay in the shadows, we have to go out of our way to like really find them. And when SIM does what we do, we don't go and offer a service just because Like, we go to a classroom and talk to like 30 youth, and maybe like 1 or 2 people will want to stay involved. Like, our work is so hard, and we have to like really dive into people's like mental like needs, and like getting to understand like their status and like why they shouldn't be ashamed of it. Like, it happened to me. Like, I was ashamed of being undocumented, that it was a curse. In reality, many years later, I was like, okay, you know what? Like, I have learned so much from this experience. If I could do it again, I would. But before, if I could do something again, I'll make sure I'll go like back in time, way back, and keep and just keep organizing. I don't know, there's just so much pain right now in our communities, and I know you all feel it, and I know that it's hard, but we have to keep fighting. I got married 2 years ago, and I recently got my green card. And it's felt crazy, because now I'm not seen as like an undocumented young person. I have my green card, and it makes me feel really torn, because I feel like my identity is one with my immigrant community. So like now with my privilege, I need to figure out like how can I use this privilege to support my undocumented brothers and sisters. And I really want to make sure that all of us together, like we read this book and like we try to like make ourselves better, because the pain that we're feeling right now is only gonna get worse if we don't do anything. So I just wanna quickly say, let's not give up. And I'm feeling really grateful to be in this movement and be in this time right now, because these are gonna be crazy times. Like looking back from 30 years from now, we're gonna be like, how did we survive 2016 and 2017? But we will, and we will make this country better, and in turn make the world better. It was gonna take time, but we're gonna do it. And it starts by you taking a stance and saying I will use my privilege to change the world, just like I'm doing now. And I'm rambling, so I just want to say thank you, and pass it on to Seren.
Thank you, Kathy. From Kathy's talk, it's very clear that there's emotional work to be done, and all of us face different emotional economies based on different pressures. In addition, from Catherine's talk, we learned that profound analysis is needed, those conversations that begin early in the evening and end in the early hours of the morning. So there's an analytic moment. The part that they do best, though, the student immigrant movement, that she didn't really speak too much about, is the organizing moment. The moment where you've done the emotional work, you've done the analytic work, and you strike strategically. And that's what's really impressed me about them. And I've noticed that even in the worst moments of the movement with Trump, the reactions are not necessarily immediate, but the reactions do come, and they come after consideration. And I say that by way of segueing to the next speaker, Mike Prokosh. Mike, to many of you, is probably already an institution, someone to whom we can turn for wisdom on so many issues. On the question of immigration, for example, Mike, for many years, was the stalwart, one of the most important organizers and activists in solidarity with struggles in Central America. He's also involved with, just a few minutes ago we were talking about this, keeping the Dorchester Community News going, a newspaper serving the largest working class community in Boston, and a relatively diverse, now largely African origin working class in Boston. And so the newspaper reflected that approach. Mike's contribution to the book focuses on the anti-war movement and how it is able to connect anti-war politics to domestic politics, specifically politics around the budget. So really clear question of, that has a global focus, but then focuses in on the US military budget and its impact on communities at home. And so with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Mike Prokosh.
Hi all. I want to talk about two challenges, and the first actually is to challenge a little bit the way you were talking, Charlie, about class and identity. The strongest working class based focused organizing that I know in Boston is being done by organizations led by people of color. City Life Vita Urbana, Chinese Progressive Association, Chelsea Collaborative. The working class isn't an entity. It doesn't exist as an entity. It's in fragments. It's fragmented by race, by income, by occupation, by gender. The working class is a project to be created, as is working class identity. And Charlie, you were describing the ways that not primarily Trump, but people like Bannon have been doing that systematically. And that's also a project that the movement behind the New Deal was taking into overdrive after World War II in 1946, the biggest strike wave in the history of the country. United Auto Workers, led by two brothers who had, in the 30s, helped the Soviet Union set up its auto industry. Victor and Walter Reuther traveled to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and they were red-baited for this afterward, of course. But these were socialists in the labor movement. And what happened was an elite, the Cold War, McCarthyism, which had two impacts. One is that it basically kicked the communists and socialists out of the labor movement and turned the labor movement into a class collaborationist, opportunistic, and bureaucratic organization that was not going to practice social movement unionism anymore. And it deprived people of my generation and Charlie's, the New Left, of the leadership, wisdom, and experience that we needed not to go off the rails. So if you want to look at where the separation between the left and a working class base started, that's a good place to start looking. But the other challenge that I wanted to talk about, which is more consequential, is the challenge of carrying out the agenda that Charlie laid out. So around 8 years ago, a small group of us started an outfit called the New Priorities Network. And its purpose, this was right after the Wall Street crash of 2008. From the crash in 2000-2001, we knew that government budgets were going to get crunched, that unemployment was going to grow, and that people were going to need services that only the federal government could provide because the states and cities didn't have the taxing power and the resources. For example, Massachusetts has to balance its budget every year. The money to bail the country out of a recession and give the working class what it needs is in the federal government. However, most of that money, half of the discretionary budget goes to the Pentagon. So how about a project to cut military spending and use it for jobs, services, and what the working class needs? And this looked like a good way to build bridges, build a movement that would be an economically based peace movement and a war movement for military conversion. And this is was not a new idea. It's actually a project that was led by black people for the last 50 years. Martin Luther King, the Black Congressional Caucus, Jobs with Peace, the Gulf Tenant Council, which proposed taking billions of dollars out of the Pentagon and using it for public housing in the southern states. So there's a long tradition of this. So we decided that it had to be grassroots, bottom up, basically because that's what it would take to sustain it long enough to, to bring this project about. You couldn't do it from the top. It had to have a solid base in order to grow and last long enough, and in order to create the trust and relationships that would be a genuine movement. And people pitched in, just to take one example, Gene Athey, one of the most brilliant organizers I've ever met, from Maryland, member of the Peace Action National Board, pulled together a coalition of 50 organizations in Maryland to cut military spending and move the money to our communities. That included everyone from the NAACP to the Baltimore Washington Labor Council, Casa de Maryland, an immigrant organization, and they managed to introduce a motion in the Maryland State Legislature to this purpose, memorializing the state's congressional delegation to act and vote that way, and Lockheed Martin crushed it by inside lobbying, and the coalition basically disintegrated. And eventually the whole project ground to a halt. One reason, of course, is that if you want to pick an issue that's the least under democratic popular control, foreign policy and military affairs are probably that issue. These are controlled by elites. They're not in people's daily lives. The forces involved are enormous, very well funded, very coordinated. It's a tough project to take on. Congress is not there. Congress is about to pass an increase of about $60 billion in the military budget, above what Trump asked for, with a lot of Democratic votes. So this is not an issue where we have a lot of support in Congress. I do have to hand it to people who are still trying to pursue this project in Boston and Massachusetts, and I think they're having a demonstration tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, around the Peace Action Massachusetts is leading this effort along with others, and I'd urge you to check that out, go to the Mass Peace Action website. But there is still a Budget for All coalition that's attempting to campaign for jobs, services, taxing the rich and corporations, and defunding the Pentagon. So there are people still trying to pull this grand coalition, this cross-issue coalition together. I think that if one of the biggest obstacles is kind of the mental obstacle, and here Wilhelm Reich said it best in 1935. The quote goes something like, it is amazing that a world population of 1 billion people, this is 1935, cannot summon up the psychic energy to throw off a handful of biopathic warmongers. It is amazing. What kind of mental thrall are we in where this is the case? So the kind of the mental dimension of organizing, which is often reduced to kind of narrative strategies or kind of the, talking about framing. There's much more than that going on that I think we need to take much more seriously, and I don't have particularly good recommendations for doing that. I would recommend, while I'm thinking about it, the latest issue of Political Research Associates newsletter, The Public Eye, which has an extraordinary article about, a couple of extraordinary articles, but one about David Koch and his long-term project on this score. But the other is about something called fourth generation warfare, which is what Bannon and others have been practicing, and it is basically a strategy of disorienting people, of challenging everything, fake news, destroying the Republican Party if necessary, of just sort of breaking up everything that people know, kind of like shock therapy, breaking up the way people's minds are organized so that you can lead them in a particular direction. And I recommend this as kind of must reading for people who are trying to figure out what the other side is doing and where they are going with it. But I think there's much, much more to say, and actually, so you're not just sitting there, there's one additional class-based project which is called Raise Up Massachusetts, which is circulating, gathering signatures right now for initiative petitions to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and for to enact paid family and medical leave. And I will just pass these around for, I think, just voters in Boston, to keep it simple, to sign if you haven't already. But here's one of them. Here's the other one. So if you're so inclined. But just to leave you with one more thought, in this extremely asymmetrical warfare that we're engaged with against Trump, the right, the Koch brothers, the very well thought out, well coordinated kind of offensive to not just take away the New Deal, but to create a theocratic state in this country and a lot of other things. There's one asymmetry that is going to make it very difficult for us to get very far, which is that they want power and we don't. They want power and we don't.